Very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful city and to be able to talk to you about my research on language comprehension. Typically, when a psychologist gives a talk, they have a whole stream of experiments that they talk about. But I took a different approach here. I will talk about theoretical concepts more broadly, and I won't inflict a lot of graphs and numbers on you. So imagination is not a topic I have thought of as sort of something guiding my research, but I did realize in preparing for this meeting that a lot of my research is relevant to that topic. So the first thing I did is look up a definition of imagination, and I went to Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. And the definition that I'm using here is imagination is the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. But I want to talk about this from the perspective of language comprehension. And you could think of language comprehension as language-driven imagination. I'll show you that a lot of what goes on in language comprehension isn't language per se, but is imagination. Very little is stated explicitly. A lot of the information or a lot of the processing is left to the comprehender. So a quote that I like, even though I don't like the book very much, is a quote by Steven Pinker from The Language Instinct. Language enables us to shape events in each other's brains with exquisite precision. So language is actually a tool that we use to manipulate other people's brains. We provide some information, but we leave it up to the comprehender's imagination to fill in the blanks. And but this brings us to the question, what is comprehension? And what I would like to propose here is something that is an old idea, but that has sort of guided my research for all these years, is the notion of a situation model. And what is a situation model? It's a mental representation of a state of affairs. So when we understand language, we're not understanding language per se. Language is the gateway to creating this representation of a state of affairs, of a situation. So to use a cartoon that I stole from the famous psychologist Gordon Bauer, it's from the New Yorker originally. It shows a visitor to New York City asking a police officer for directions to a building. The police officer uses his language skills, or first of all, he retrieves his knowledge about the layout of Manhattan, or that part of Manhattan, from his long-term memory, and then converts his ideas into language and conveys that to the listener. The listener then has the task to construct a spatial representation, a situation model of that part of Manhattan, and specifically his route from A to B. But he doesn't succeed, as you can tell. In this case, that may be because language is linear and space is three-dimensional. So there's a lot of research showing that it's difficult to convey spatial information in language. For example, if I were to describe, if I knew all of your names and I would describe the people sitting here, then, well, suppose they were sitting around the table, then if I start with this person, then this person would be first in the language and this one would be last. They would be far apart in the linguistic structure, even though they're very close in the spatial structure. So space is a difficult thing to convey in language. Nevertheless, what this cartoon illustrates is that we go from one situational representation via language production, speaking, to language understanding, to another situational representation. In this case, that transfer from one brain to the next is not very successful. And I'll show you a much more dramatic example of this. So why do situation models matter? Well, in 1977, there was the biggest airplane crash in history. Hundreds and hundreds of people died. And what happened? Well, it occurred on Tenerife, on the Canary Islands. It was a period in which there was low visibility. It was unusually busy, such that flights to Gran Canaria, another airport, had to be diverted to Tenerife. So that's why it was unusually busy. Because it was so busy, the runway that planes used to take off was also used as a runway, as a taxiway for planes coming down. Now, there was a KLM plane that was ready for takeoff, but there was a Pan American, which used to be an American airline, taxiing back. Okay, so what happened? Well, the KLM first officer said, "We are now at takeoff." And the Spanish controller said, "Okay." But what went on? The KLM officer meant to say, "We are taking off right now." But the controller thought the KLM plane is stationary at the point where it's going to take off. So the controller acknowledged, "Okay, I understand that you are at the point of taking off." But in fact, the plane was already moving. And that's why when it crashed into the Pan Am plane. Now, there was a lot more to this. It wasn't just linguistic understanding. And in fact, I gave this, I told this story once to a group of people, and one of them was from KLM, and they were upset about this story. But the point is that the language is, as I said, a set of cues to form mental representations. In this case, there was a miscommunication because the cues were used differently. There's a whole report about this situation, and one of the things that was mentioned is, well, wasn't the KLM officer wrong saying we are taking off? Because that usually means we are in the process of taking off. But he said we are at takeoff. But you can also say the children are at play, meaning they are playing right now. So there are situations in which this can mean we are in the process of doing so. Should the Spanish controller then have said, no, wait, maybe, but the Spanish controller could have, assumed that at means we are at the location. So it's a very simple misunderstanding, and it led to an enormous crash. What's happened since then is that they've standardized the language, so now people are only supposed to use certain phrases, and that minimizes, of course, misunderstandings. Now, what is involved in building situation models? Well, we talked about the linguistic cues. What these linguistic cues do is they activate information or representations in our long-term memory. Let's say, for example, in the temporal lobe, where we have stored the meanings of words and the grammatical class of words, whether they're nouns or verbs or other information. So that needs to be activated. Then a sentence consists of multiple words. We need to integrate the meanings of the words. So if you take a red balloon, it's a different red than red wine. So it's not just the meanings of the individual words, it's also how they combine. Red means something different in the context of wine than it does in the context of balloon. And then we're also talking about discourse integration. So discourse is, for example, a talk, but it's also a poem or a scientific article or a novel. So each of these levels, the sentence and the discourse, have their own rules. For example, newspaper articles always start with the most important thing, because you want people to continue reading. But stories usually leave out that information, because otherwise you already know, the clue. Or the point of the story. So each type of discourse has its own rules, and people are members of a certain culture or subculture are aware of these rules and effortlessly apply them when they understand language. Now let me go into a little bit more detail with a very specific example from Sherlock Holmes. I'll first read it to you. Sherlock Holmes took his bottle from the corner of the mantelpiece and his hypodermic needle from its neat morocco case. With his long, white, nervous fingers, he adjusted the delicate needle and rolled back his left shirt cuff, For some time his eyes rested thoughtfully upon the sinewy form, arm, and wrist, all dotted and scarred with innumerable puncture marks. Finally he thrust the sharp point home, pressed down the tiny piston, and sank back into the velvet-lined armchair with a long sigh of satisfaction. Okay, so what goes on when we understand a text like this? And it may take more than just one reading by me to understand it, because it's easier when you read it yourself. Okay, let's first look at the entities that are mentioned. So we have Sherlock Holmes, who is referred to by his name, but also by the pronoun he. So we can use he as a cue to connect the sentences. He refers back to Sherlock Holmes. But in blue, I have information that pertains to the syringe. The needle, which is part of the syringe, the sharp point is also part of the syringe, and so is the piston. So those are the objects. But there's more going on. When we read this story, we don't just go by the explicitly stated information. So let's look at it a little bit further. Well, there's the setting. Where does this take place? It takes place in a living room, because mantelpieces are found in living rooms, especially older living rooms. And Sherlock Holmes is set in the 1880s or something like that. We, and artificial intelligence research has shown this, or has proposed this, have stored in our long-term memory representations of stereotypical spaces like classrooms, movie theaters, churches, and also living rooms. And so we have a frame, Minsky called it a frame, of what a room like that looks like and what we can expect to find in it. In a living room we expect to find chairs, armchairs, and so on, especially in a room of that age. And so we activate all this knowledge automatically when we read the text. None of this is stated explicitly. Then how about the objects? Well, a bottle is mentioned. We all have stored in our long-term memory what a bottle looks like, but also what actions it affords. What can you do with the bottle? How do you interact with the bottle? And we know from research on apraxia, where patients have had a stroke or something like that and have difficulty interacting with objects, that they sometimes cannot physically interact with a particular object. And also, they can't identify it. So when they see a bottle, they might say something completely different. And other people have, for example, a problem with animals. So when they see a picture of a dolphin, they may say heron, a bird, instead of a dolphin. Some of these the damage to the brain can be very category specific. Okay, but in this case we're talking about a bottle and we're assuming a normal reader. So they know what a bottle is like, activate that knowledge. What actions it affords? Well, it affords storing liquids and powders, and that's important. Another object that's mentioned is a syringe. What does it look like? We haven't stored meanings of words, but also the visual representations of the objects that are referred to by these words. So we know what a syringe looks like. It has a piston, the contents. I took a picture of an old Sherlock Holmes style syringe here. It has a point, a needle, contents in the cylinder, and so on. So what actions does a syringe afford? Well, it affords the removal and injection of fluids. How is it used? Well, we all have some experience with this, not necessarily because we are medically trained, but we've used it to spray our friends or something like that. Okay, so we have the setting, we have objects, but there's also actions and goals. And in this case, there are agents and goals. In this case, there's only one agent, Sherlock Holmes. Watson is not in this scene. So what can we infer about what Holmes is doing? Well, he's transferring liquid from a bottle to his bloodstream using a syringe. That's what he is doing. Something else that we can infer is that this injection changes his emotional state. He was nervous before and he's relaxed afterwards. That activates our background knowledge that addicted individuals are anxious when they are deprived from their favorite substance and satisfied when their urge is met. So what we can infer from that then is that Holmes is addicted. He has all these puncture marks on his forearm, and that liquid is some drug. So all of that is not explicitly stated, but we can infer it from the text by using our imagination. And our imagination, in this case, is our vast storehouse of previous experiences about places, objects, actions, motivation, and so on. So how would this work when you are actually reading or listening to a story? Well, the idea is that you ask why after every sentence. You try to find causal connections or motivations between sentences, and those connections are called coherence building inferences. So you activate knowledge from your long-term memory to fill in the gaps. And that's what we do automatically. It's not that we have to expend a lot of conscious effort to do this. It occurs mostly automatically unless we have very little background to go. So suppose the story is about some ritual, a Japanese tea ceremony or an Indian wedding or something like that, where all sorts of things occur that we're not familiar with. Then we have to do a lot of conscious processing to make sense of the scene. So, the coherent situation model, for you to be able to build it, requires linguistic cues and relevant background knowledge. If you don't speak the language, but you do have the background knowledge, you cannot form a situation model. If I take a novel in Polish from here or a scientific book, I can maybe recognize a few words. I can recognize these words because that looks like evacuation, and that looks like the Italian word uscita, which I think, uscita? Okay, uscita, okay, which means exit. And so that's Latin, I guess, but that's as far as I can get. So you need the cues and you need the relevant background knowledge. Now, a lot of research has gone into what is the format of situation models. In fact, I'm collapsing 20 years of research into a few slides here. The traditional idea was that language comprehension involves the manipulation of abstract symbols, such as propositions. I'll show you an example in a little bit. And a more recent idea is that language comprehension involves perceptual simulations. So the traditional idea about situation models was, well, yes, they are representations of situations, but they are mostly abstract, in networks of propositions. And a more recent idea is, no, they actually involve our experiences with the world. So we do represent what something looks like, and we do represent the actions that the agent is performing we understand these actions because we are activating the representations that we use to perform those actions ourselves. So that's a more recent idea, and if you follow the debate, then we're sort of stuck in the middle now, where I think the consensus is that both might be going on. Although some people might say, well, sure, perceptual simulations go on, but only after you've formed your abstract representations, and others are saying, no, it's more of a combination. And some people are saying, no, it's just perceptual simulations. So we're not there yet, but to give you an example of what I mean with the differences, this is a study that we did in 2002, and it was published in Psychological Science, in which we presented subjects with sentences such as, the ranger saw the eagle in the nest. Now, you can convert that to propositions, that sentence. It contains two propositions, at least, and a proposition has a predicate and argument. So saw, the verb is a predicate, has two arguments, ranger, eagle, and then the second proposition is that the eagle is in the nest, in eagle nest. And so we can combine these propositions because they have one overlapping argument, namely the eagle. The same is true of the second sentence, the ranger saw the eagle in the sky. So in a propositional representation, there's not much difference between these two. You just have these nodes, eagle, sky, and so on, in a network. And whether it's a nest or a sky doesn't matter much. But if you think of a perceptual representation, it should matter. When the eagle is in the sky, it has its wings outstretched. When it's in the nest, it's perched. It's sitting and it has its wings drawn in. So what we did is we presented sentences to subjects, like the ranger saw the eagle in the sky, and then we told subjects, now you're going to see a picture and you have to say whether it denotes a word or depicts a word that's in the sentence. So the correct answer is, if you see a picture of an eagle, you should say yes, whether it's has its wings out or not. Shouldn't matter if you form a propositional representation. But if you form a perceptual representation, it should matter. When you see a picture like this, you should be slower than when you see this picture. These are the original pictures that we used. So subjects read many of these sentences and responded to many pictures, but consistently you find, and this experiment has been replicated many, many times, you find people are slower when the picture mismatches than when it matches. And that's been taken to be evidence for the fact that they form perceptual representations. They represent the shape of the object, or the entity in this case, the eagle, even though it's not explicitly stated in the text. So you could say they're using their imagination, but in a very systematic way. We've done very recent experiments in which we use I'd say a method that really rules out any alternative explanations for this finding. It's a method called continuous flash suppression, in which we can suppress semantic processing and we still get the same effect. Okay, now I'm going to take this to another level. I mentioned that there are distinctions between propositions, which you can think of as abstract representations. They are symbols that don't look like the thing they are denoting, whereas a perceptual representation, perceptual symbol, does preserve analog information about the shape or the orientation of an object or the color. And what I try to do in this article is I try to combine the view that we have abstract representation with the view that we have perceptual representations. And what I'm suggesting is that when we use language, it can be completely embedded in the environment, or it can be completely distinct from or divorced from the environment, but there are also steps in between. And there are 5 steps that I distinguish in this article, and I call them demonstration, modification, projection, displacement, and abstraction. So let's go through those. Well, here are these 5 levels. So the top level is the most embedded in the environment, and the bottom level the least. And then it occurred to me that if you take imagination, it's just the other way around. The less something is embedded in the environment, the more you need to use imagination. So let's look at demonstration. Here we have a cooking show in which the cook, in this case Jamie Oliver, is cutting a bell pepper. And so he's explaining to his viewers how to do this. He has the knife and he has the bell. So, and he's performing the action. So he's saying, you cut it like this. You actually see what he's doing. You see the object that he's referring to. And everything that he talks about is in the environment. So if you try to formalize this in some way, we don't have to go through all of it, and you can't even see all of it, I guess, the agent is in the environment, and the speaker is in the environment. He is the speaker and the agent. The objects that he's talking about are in the environment. The action that he's performing are in the environment. So they're all taking place at the same time and the same place. Now, if we then look at modification, that's one step beyond it. He could say to his assistant, get me the broccoli from the fridge. Now, the helper needs to access information from long-term memory about what broccoli looks like, walk over to, and what the fridge looks like, walk over to it, get the broccoli, give it to him. So what we have now is that some of the information that the speaker is talking about is not directly visible in the environment. So the listener needs to use imagination to activate that information. And if he doesn't know what broccoli looks like, the speaker could give him another cue, something like it looks a little bit like a green cauliflower or something like that. So we can actually use, just like, you could describe a zebra as a horse with black and white stripes. It's not perfect because a zebra is not a horse and the stripes are not exactly vertical like that. But it still is sufficient for you to be able to recognize a horse. Same could be true of the cauliflower. So what happens here is that once a target object has been retrieved, now the person sees the cauliflower and no longer needs to keep active this mental symbol of the cauliflower. So we're one step down. Now with projection, we're 2 steps down. And this, of course, is a very important feature of language. Language allows us to use displacement, to move away from the here and now. We can talk about the here and now. I can talk about my laptop and about the people walking outside and the things on the table. But I could also talk about, well, I couldn't say much about the history of Krakow, but you just told us a little bit. Well, that's displacement. You told us about the Pope here. Well, here we have a soccer coach. It's also in the past because it's Louis van Gaal, explaining to his players what he wants them to do when the game starts. So you go over there, and when he has the ball, you need to be over there. So he's projecting into the future. He's using part of the environment because he's pointing at the pitch, the field, but he leaves a lot open to the imagination of the players. The tour guide in Pompeii is talking about the past. So she's saying, right before Mount Etna erupted, this building was used by the senator, this was a bathhouse, this was the house of a prostitute, and so on. And we need to sort of overlay our imagination onto the environment. There's something there that we can use to hang our hats on, so to speak. But we need to supplement what's out there with our imagination. So in this case, there are some objects that we can use, but we're talking about a different time, and we need to retrieve more from our long-term memory to make sense of this. So we're looking at the third row. The agents, the prostitute and the senator and so on, are not in the scene. The objects are partly in the scene, partly not, right? Because the buildings are partly destroyed, they're ruins, and the events are also in the past. Now, if we get to displacement, then we're even one step further. For example, when we read a novel, now there's nothing in the environment that we find ourselves in that's useful. We need to imagine the ship and the whale and the captain and the sea. And we're using, in order to do so, we're using our long-term memory, experiences that we have with either being at sea or seeing movies about whales. That sort of information we need to bring into the game, so to speak. So we see that with each step away from embeddedness in the environment, we need to up the level of imagination that we're performing. And then we get to the level of abstraction. For example, you read a science book like Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is about things like recursion and so on. Those are very abstract concepts. Now it doesn't really help us much to, to infer things. Let's say what a computer looks like isn't going to help us to understand these concepts. So now we need to use abstract symbols. There's really nothing in our current environment that's useful, and a lot of the perceptual and motor representations that we have are also not going to be useful. So what we see when we have, when we go through, is that in each case we're building situation models, but the building bricks that we use for them differ with the levels of abstraction that occur. And if we go back a little bit to the novel, of course, different people have different interpretations of novels. Why is that? Well, we saw that with the airplane example, because not everybody understands linguistic cues the same way, and not every reader has the same background knowledge. So text can constrain to a great deal what we activate in terms of knowledge, but they can also leave things to the imagination. And I'm just thinking about a current situation in the, well, no, I get to that later, sorry. Let me first talk about, so what I'm talking about is basically our capacity to make inferences, to learn more about the situation than is stated explicitly by a writer or a speaker. Now you could say, but why don't speakers just, why aren't they very explicit? So why don't they leave nothing to the imagination? Well, that's because then our conversations would be extremely tedious and long. So if I say, for example, well, we went to the restaurant Cargo last night, and the food was great, but the server forgot half of our orders, so we didn't leave a very large tip. Then A, that is correct, that was true, and B, you all understand it, even though I didn't say anything about what a waiter typically does. The waiter is somebody who comes to your table, gives you the menu, takes your orders, takes the orders to the chef cooks the food, and so on. All of that is left implicit. Why? Why didn't I state that? Because you already know it. I would basically be telling you nothing you didn't know already, and the story would be far less interesting and take longer to tell. So leaving out information is critical. You want to rely on people's knowledge of situations so that you don't have to describe the situation in detail. But the downside of it is that you may leave out too much. You often see that students do that when they write a thesis. Steven Pinker calls it the curse of knowledge. They think that the reader already knows all the stuff that they know, and so they leave out critical information. But another problem is that sometimes people use their inferential machinery, the skills that they have to comprehend more than is stated explicitly, and then you get things like this. This is the cover of Abbey Road, the last actual album by the Beatles, and there are lots of theories about what's going on here, and the biggest theory is that Paul McCartney is actually dead, and this is not Paul McCartney, but this is a double. And why is that theory there? Well, first of all, look, so there's John Lennon, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney, George Harrison. Well, Paul McCartney is walking barefoot. He's also wearing a dark suit. He's also the only one that has his right foot first. And so this has been taken to mean that, look, he is different. This is not the real Paul McCartney. And then if you look at the suits, there's something, a whole theory that says, well, yeah, John is wearing white. He is the priest or something like that. And then Ringo is wearing black. He is the pallbearer, or I don't know exactly. And George is wearing jeans. He is the gravedigger. So people have constructed elaborate theories to account for just this album cover. So they're doing what we're all doing, right? When we understand language or events, or pictures in this case, we make inferences, but some inferences go too far. And of course, a great example of this is conspiracy thinking, which is a topic that I'm currently interested in. And you see that a lot in politics, of course. I'm just thinking of something very recent in American politics where there's a Democratic candidate called Tulsi Gabbard, who is a little bit of a maverick, so she is completely in line with a lot of the things that the Democratic Party wants. Hillary Clinton, who's not running, was on a podcast last week and saying that Tulsi Gabbard is actually a Russian asset. The Russians are using Tulsi Gabbard to disrupt. So she's saying that about somebody who's in her own party. And then she has this whole theory about why the Russians are doing this. And then Gabbard says, yeah, that's not true. And then now Clinton says, yeah, I never said that explicitly. I just said somebody, a female candidate of the Democrats, is doing this. I didn't mention anybody by name, but it's clear that she's mentioning her. And so now there's this whole debate. Is there this influence on the elections or not? Is it a conspiracy theory to think that there is this influence and people find all sorts of evidence for it or against it? And what you see there is what comprehension at work. People are either using their comprehension mechanisms too much, too intensely, or they're not using them enough. They're not connecting all the dots that they're supposed to connect. And it's interesting then to take something from the medical community into account, and I'll read it to you. It's from a book by Brotherton, I forget his first name, and it's called Suspicious Minds. It's on conspiracy theories. And it says, the medical community has an expression to remind themselves not to mistake coincidence for cause. True, and unrelated. It's true that symptoms of developmental disorders like autism often become apparent when 1 or 2 years of age. It's also true that if parents follow the recommended vaccine schedule, their children receive a large number of vaccines at the same time. The overwhelming weight of scientific evidence, however, shows that the two are unrelated. The connection is nothing more than a coincidence of timing. But our intuition is rarely impressed by statistics, especially when they tell us there's no sense to be made of a coincidence. Our intuition wants the dots to be connected. And so what I've tried to tell you is often we need to connect the dots to form a coherent representation of something that somebody is telling us, but we can't go too far in doing this, and then we create conspiracy theories. So the take-home message that I want to give then is we want to construct situation models. They're often very useful. They can lead to misunderstanding, and they can also lead to conspiracy theories. I feel that what we know about comprehension can be used to combat conspiracy thinking, so that's going to be my next line of research. Thank you.